Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back, don't they? Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked room today, didn't you?
How do the dead come back, Mother? What's the secret of the dead come back?
The Lady and Death, a companion piece to Durer's print by Vernon Lee. 1. Since the portrait of my ancestress Agnes seems to have struck you, said Dr. Conrad Weber, and since even more you seem to feel that our little town is still warm and living with the past, I think I will tell you a very curious legend existing in our family, and of which Agnes Weberin, whom we call, after the Latin distich in her picture, Agnes Alcestis, is the heroine. But before beginning, I had better show you the effigy of the other chief persons in the story. He had been taking me the round along the wooden causeway, still intact, of the towers and gatehouses, which gave that little town of Erlach, high above its narrow valley, the air of a great city, say Jerusalem, in one of Dürer's backgrounds. And we were walking now in the wide principal street, the Herrengasse, planted with sweet-smelling lime trees and set with big gabled houses, all with trim flowers behind their window gratings. The street is closed, not by any buildings, nor even by the city walls, but by a glimpse of country opposite, of steep green pasture and distant compact fir woods. And against this view, as against a piece of blue-green tapestry, there stands a fountain surrounded by a statue. The fountain is of a pattern common in southern Germany and Switzerland, and not without a pleasant reminiscence of the original village drinking trough of rough-hewn fir trunks, an octagonal basin like a tub, and rising in its middle a pillar, with iron spouts spurting 4 thin rills of water. But on the top of the pillar is a statue, a knight in armour, leaning on his lance. The fountain, said the doctor, was restored, as the inscription tells us, by Berchthold Weber in 1545, the husband of Agnes, surnamed Alcestis. But the statue is, as you see, considerably earlier, and belongs to that interesting and insufficiently known school of Franconian stonemasons, who have left so many fine effigies of knights in our churches. It represents not St. George, you see the dragon is missing, but St. Theodulus, a holy warrior whom you have probably never heard of. Do you know, I answered, it happens by one of those coincidences which are perpetually surprising us, that I have heard of St. Theodulus, and not a month ago, and that now you remind me of him, I am extremely interested in his legend. His legend? Why, that was what I intended, so to speak, telling you, replied the doctor. Pray tell me first how much you already know about St. Theodulus. Has this to do with Agnes Alcestis? I asked, for I did not want to lose her story. It has everything to do with her. I can tell you what St. Theodulus is reported to have done here in Erlach, but you shall tell me what he did elsewhere, for we are badly off for saints' biographies in this Lutheran town. Well, I replied, I can tell you only this much, that a few weeks ago, as I was taking a walk in one of the Tyrolese valleys, not far from the source of the Isar, I found, near some remote cottages, in a runnel of snow water spurting across the path, one of those little water wheels which the children make in those parts of the world. Only in this case the toy consisted not of a hammer merely hammering on an empty preserve can, but of 2 little wooden dolls, who, as the water turned the wheel, thumped unceasingly upon each other. The thing rather fascinated me, and on closer examination I found that one of the figures had horns, while the other, with a sort of helmet carved on its head, was brandishing a wooden cross. A little girl came out of one of the chalets, and, seeing me in contemplation of the toy, told me her big brother had made it, and that it represented St. Theodulus fighting with the devil. That was all the information to be extracted on the subject, but I often think of the 2 wooden mannikins in the brook, and wonder how long they will go on hammering, without a pause, on each other, through fine weather and snowstorm. I was looking at the fountain while speaking, and for a moment the dark green alpine valley, its white glacier stream and meadows painted blue with crow's bill, rose up in my mind, and made a background, instead of that medieval street, for the statue of the saint. The weather had given him the look of being made of rusty iron, and on his hip swung a real iron sword, and an iron pennon creaked like a weather vane from his lance. He reminded me of the metal knights at Innsbruck round Maximilian's tomb, but less barbaric and finer. The armour was rendered with every detail of strap and buckle, but the beardless face, surrounded by a nest or nimbus of wiry hair, was of archaic rigidity. Yet, doll-like though he was, it had an amount of expression, a tense, worn, pathetic resoluteness. "What you say interests me very much," answered the doctor, his eye following mine along the fountain, "and I am rather struck by what you say about the saint and the devil going on thumping one another day and night for ever and ever. That is the characteristic of all mythology. The saints or gods, or whatever they are, never leave off from their especial act, however unnoticed in the imagination of the people. It must have been the case with St. Theodulus. And the question arises, was the legend which you met in that Catholic Tyrolese valley an outcome of the story which purports really to have taken place in Protestant times in this Lutheran town of Erlach, but arranged to suit the requirements of Catholicism? And the question arises, was the legend which you met in that Catholic Tyrolese valley an outcome of the story which purports really to have taken place in Protestant times in this Lutheran town of Erlach, but arranged to suit the requirements of Catholicism? Or was our Erlach story merely an adaptation, connected with real dates and persons, of an old Catholic legend which Protestantism could not destroy?" I felt bound to protest. "'Pon my word," I said, "you are too much of a German, dear Dr. Weber. Here am I waiting to be told the story of one of your own ancestors, and instead of telling it me, you launch out into scientific speculations about its mythological aspect." The doctor smiled. "Perhaps you're right," he answered, "and I will do my best to tell you the story like a real story, the more so that I believe it is a true one. Well, to begin, but first let me draw your attention to the carvings on the base of the column and on the slabs of the fountain. They have to do with the business." I had noticed them already. Like the rest of the fountain, they were imitation Italian of the 16th century. They represented cupids, but cupids holding trophies of death's head and crossbones. "When you have told me the story," I said, "I shall ask you to give the rein to your scientific interests, and to tell me the reason why, throughout all your German art of the Renaissance, from Dürer to Holbein to the smallest little master, there is always death skulking round the corner." "Ah, you've noticed that," replied Dr. Weber. The skeleton grinning behind a door, or looking down from the tree, or putting his hand in the pedlar's pack, or waving his hourglass at the lady and her gallant. Everywhere death. Herr Tod, as he is called in the ballad I shall tell you part of. My story bears precisely on that point. By the way, can you see in your mind's eye Dürer's print of The Night and Death? 2. "My ancestor Berchthold," began Dr. Weber as we sat after early dinner in the little steep garden behind his ancestral house, "was the most remarkable physician of a family in which, as you know, we have practiced medicine from father to son for 400 years. And I think I may say, judging by contemporary accounts and his books and manuscripts, one of the most remarkable philosophers of his day, the forerunner of the chemists and anatomists of the 17th century. He had been born in 1480 of Conrad Weber and Barbara Perlacherin, and returned to his native town of Erlach about 1525, after years of study and travel in Italy and the East. Returned not without a pretty bad reputation already for illicit knowledge. You must not imagine that Erlach, even in its greatest days, was a busy trading or manufacturing town like Nuremberg or Basel. It took its political importance from being on the crossroads from North Germany to Switzerland, and from Frankfurt to Italy. But it was then, as now, an agricultural centre. and our forebears, burghers or knights, were merely the farmers of the neighbouring fertile districts, able to store forage and grain on their impregnable hillside, and thus to victual or to starve contending potentates. Such being the case, they were not accustomed to science and philosophy, and the fact of their having followed the Lutheran movement had merely given them a narrow-minded pietism, so that Berchthold Weber, a Catholic, but of the slack pattern of the wicked Italians, a friend of Erasmus, a hanger-on of godless worldly prelates, a philosopher, and a man who openly declared that diseases were not sent by heaven, Dr. Berchthold, I say, was not looked on with favour. And the rumour of the strange laboratory he fitted up in his house, of the queer animals he kept, the bones and skeletons he collected, and, they said, even bought at the gallows under Ravenstone, did not improve his reputation. So that, although he was not openly molested, people fought shy of him, and the celebrated Dr. Stumpfius, in a sermon at the Wolfgangkirche, even went the length of blaming his eminent fellow-citizen, Councillor Heinrich Stoss, for giving his daughter Agnes in marriage to what he called a noted follower of Epicurus. This Agnes, the little maid Agnes of the Stosses, was the one whose portrait you have seen, with the Latin distich comparing her to Alcestis, and I suspect that the choice of the elderly and not very well-famed Dr. Berchthold was an only child's wilful decision, reluctantly given into by her doting father. But for all the preacher's insinuations, it was impossible for the burghers of Erlach to fall upon or exile so quiet and harmless a person as my learned ancestor, or one so often visited and sent for by the greatest princes. Moreover, it was certain that when the plague came to Franconia in 1525 and decimated all the neighbouring towns and villages, the city of Erlach was wonderfully little visited by the scourge, and many of those sick of plague were saved, owing, ostensibly at least, to the precautions taught the citizens by Berchthold Weber, and the new-fangled remedies which he applied. But of course, although this debt of gratitude made it impossible to molest the doctor's person, the sense of it only increased the existing badness of his reputation. For it began to be whispered at every fountain and washing trough, and hinted more openly in every wine cellar frequented by the theologians and the more zealous burghers, that if Berchthold Weber had succeeded in stemming the tide of the plague and saving his countrymen's lives, this was owing not really to his nefarious learning, but to a compact he had made with the Prince of Terrors in person, promising his own life in return for those of his fellow citizens, out of sinful curiosity and carnful vaingloriousness. Just the sort of disgraceful rubbish which our forefathers were always bandying about, eh? I quite agree. But was the accusation false? There, my dear friend, I confess I do not feel so sure. People's contemporaries often accuse them of things they haven't done, but not so often of things which they themselves don't think quite possible in others. Among all the 1,000 witches who were burnt in Germany, a fair proportion in our town of Erlach, and the papers of the trial still exist, I don't suppose there were 10 who didn't believe in witchcraft, and a large proportion had been to the Brocken Sabbath, or thought they had. Apply this to the case of Dr. Berchthold Weber. Nonsense, you'll exclaim. A learned man, a physician, a discoverer who forestalled Leeuwenhoek and Haller. But in those days of Paracelsus and Cardan, one could be all that much and yet believe in things which every modern schoolchild laughs at. For science consists merely in fitting a few facts which we discover or guess at into a scheme given ready-made by tradition and by fancy, and this scheme varies perpetually. Ours today is full of unintelligible things called laws, forces, and so forth. Theirs, in the days of Berchthold Weber, had other paraphernalia, more picturesque and perhaps, after all, as reasonable. Essences, virtues, almost human in shape, spirits like those invoked by Faust and drawn by Dürer in his Melancholia, bogies like the ones of Wohlgemuth and Cranach, Let us suppose that our ingenious and learned contemporary Dr. Weissmann had been brought up to think of heredity, evolution, etc., etc., not as laws, but as real entities, sorting the world's affairs from thrones up in the Empyrean. Supposing Dr. Weissmann to think this, would he not be acting like a genuine man of science if he took the necessary steps to meet, let us say, the Lady Panmixia, attired like a muse or sibyl, with attributes and fluttering ribbons, and ask her, face to face, the true history of her relations with the spirit of natural selection, her honoured parent? You laugh, because, allow me to say so, you are a mere writer, and believe in science with a big S, as something infallible and unchanging. We, men of science, are more humble, and therefore more appreciative of our forerunners, and know that we should have thought exactly as they did. Dr. Weissmann, had he lived in the 16th century, would have acted, well, like my ancestor Berchthold, and my ancestor Berchthold acted like a genuine man of science when, thirsting to know the secrets of death, he applied for information at headquarters, went to learn the how and why of disease and dissolution from Herr Tod himself. Learn from death himself. You think that, perhaps, is a metaphor. It is a very fine one, and, like the finest metaphors, it is fine because it is literal. Learn from death, not merely by standing by the bed of dying people and cutting up their bodies when once dead. No, my dear friend, but by going down to the Totesdal, to Death's Valley, and making a tryst, a compact with the skeleton Herr in person, as the burgesses and theologians of Erlach, on the evidence of a certain woodcutter, asserted Berchthold Weber to have done at the time of the Black Death. 3. I believe he did it, continued Dr. Weber, as we were walking up and down the narrow garden closed on all sides by gabled burghers' houses, by high-roofed barns smelling deliciously of hay and cattle, and where, on the open side, framed by great walnut trees, the valley slanted sheer, with another piece of old city walls and towers across it. I believe he did it because I believe she did it. But come and see her once more. Her portrait was hanging on the wide wooden staircase which led up out of the big entrance hall where the swallows nested above the doctor's dog-cart and the children's latest withered Christmas tree, surrounded by the portraits of bearded worthies in ruffs and wigged worthies in bands, surrounded also by quaint mottos in praise of God, of wine, and of song, painted in red Gothic letters along the walls. The portrait was by some humble imitator of Holbein, and poor though it was, it had a rigid, delicate line, and pale, pure distinction of feature, unmarred by shadows, which suited the lady's person and history. She had the beauty so rare among the women which that school painted, but which, when it exists, no other school renders like that one. A beauty of extreme rareness, eminently exceptional, and with its thin and perfect features and noble bearing, more than patrician, queenly. She was represented in a stiff bodice grown black with time, and just faintly showing a mixture of gold thread and gold loops, the pale hair hardly visible under the big white wing-like cap, a flower, something of the kind of the hyacinth, in the long thin hand. She was no longer young, yet you could hardly say that she was old, emaciated not by years, but by some tragedy inherent in her noble brows and delicate loving mouth, and great eyes looking from deep vaulted sockets far into the world, a world of mystery and pity. Is your ancestress, Frau Agnes Weber, daughter of Heinrich Stoss and wife to Berchthold Weber, is your ancestress really all she strikes me? I asked the doctor. Or has my fancy already taken the cue from the thing you have hinted at, and from that Latin distich comparing her for piety and fortitude to the queen of Greek Admetos, whom of the poets write? She certainly looks as if she might be some medieval Alcestis years after her stay in the kingdom of Hades, but with the remembrance of it always in her eyes. Agnes Alcestis, that is just it, answered the doctor reverently. Well, yes, I believe she did it. Historically, he went on, as we still stood on that landing, we know little about her. She came of a very old burgher family, the only child of Heinrich Stoss, who was town councillor and died a burgomaster of this town. There is an allusion to her, as I told you, in one of the famous Strumphius's letters, blaming Heinrich Stoss for giving his little maiden, only 18 years old, to Berchthold Weber, a Catholic, though a noted follower of the atheist Epicurus, a man who under cover of medicine cultivates vain practices and impious notions, teaching that health and sickness are in man's hands, not God's. Moreover, as Dr. Strumphius, who perhaps had his own eye on this young heiress, tells us, a man no longer young, 20 years older than his bride, and taking advantage of the waywardness of a spoilt child's fancy and the ungodly weakness of a widowed father. A sort of Desdemona story. One might imagine the little maid Agnes falling in love with the learned elderly doctor for the sake of his wondrous learning, his strange accounts of travel and discovery, and his devotion to the poor sick folk. Be this as it may, we know that they were married in 1530 and came 3 years later to settle in this house, where Berchthold died in January 1565, and Agnes 11 months later. Agnes bore Dr. Berchthold 3 children, Werner, Barbara, and Ulrich, from which last we are descended. These 3 children all survived their parents. I want you to mark this fact, for it shows that Agnes Alcestis was saved one possible tragedy in her life. Neither does it appear from Berchthold's carefully kept family records that any of these children was ever dangerously ill, and as we find them all married early and safely established as prosperous citizens, we may conclude that they did not give their parents unnecessary trouble by their conduct. On the other hand, neither the family records nor the city archives mention any loss of fortune or danger from fire, as was then so common, or destruction of property in warfare, so that on this score also Agnes Weberin was unusually fortunate. What circumstances, therefore, could have given rise to that comparison of the doctor's wife with Alcestis? What calamity could have left that look upon her face, in which, as you at once felt, there is the record of some great tragedy? Besides that Latin distich and the ballad I shall read you later, only one indication still remains, and that is even more mysterious. Here it is. Dr. Weber had taken me downstairs again, and entered the long, narrow room which was his study, as it had been 350 years ago the study of his ancestor Berchthold. He took from a shelf a great Latin Bible, printed at Mainz in the 15th century, and turned to the manuscript leaves of the back. Here, he said, are Berchthold Weber's family records put down year by year with laconic accuracy. See? 1531, 3rd February, our little son Ulrich is born. 18th March, my dear wife Agnes goes to church the first time since childbirth. Deep snow on the ground, but nothing to repine at. Laus Deo. July 1539. Our little daughter Barbara has measles, but of a benign form, and happily recovers. Laus Deo. Then, October 1544, my wife Agnes and I decide upon restoring the fountain, much out of repair, of St. Theodulus from devotion to that saint, and ordering a painted window for our chapel in the Ulrichs church, showing the saint in question and ourselves kneeling in thanksgiving to God. Thanksgiving for what? For general prosperity and immunity from many evils? I scarcely think so. For immediately before this comes an enigmatic entry. Try and spell it out. I fancy the handwriting is very unsteady. August 1544. This month it has pleased the highest to search the heart and mind of Agnes, my wife, and myself, trying us both by different and unheard of trials. and Agnes, my wife especially, as no woman of our times has ever been tried. Wherefore let us bear for ever a humble, contrite, and loving heart in dulci magno jubilo." "That," said Dr. Weber, after replacing the sheet of tissue paper over the faded minute writing and putting the volume back upon its shelf, "is the third of the only 3 remaining genuine records, the Fountain of St. Theodulus, for the painted window was destroyed when Erlach was sacked by Wallenstein." This entry of Dr. Berchthold's, the portrait of Agnes Alcestis, they none of them tell us the meaning of each other on their own, and none explain in the least why Agnes Weberin should have been compared to the Greek queen who went down to the kingdom of death to save the life of her husband Admetos. Mechanically, Dr. Weber had pushed open the study window, and we were in the garden once more, where the scent from the barns and the smell of the lime flowers filled the twilight. "The explanation," he continued, "is given by the legend, as we were all of us taught as children. As for the rest, every child in Erlach knows it, and as, until these cultured days, you could buy it in rough ballad form and printed on cartridge paper at every fair in Franconia. And that ballad is the story of Alcestis. Alcestis, the wife of Admetos, king of Perai, became Alcestis, wife of Berchthold Weber, physician of Erlach. And Dr. Weber, walking up and down among the roses and stocks of his garden, the syringas and tall scarlet runners, suddenly stopped and looked full at me through his round spectacles. "Agnes Stoss," he went on after a minute, "a beautiful, imaginative and self-willed girl, marries the man whom she had made her ideal, and learns that the reality is more interesting, fuller and better even than the ideal, realizing in detail the life of devotion to truth, of tenderness to suffering of her husband. And Berchthold, to whom the undreamed of happiness comes just at the age when happiness begins no longer to be expected, expands, grows young and human in her love. Then there are the children. Well, after some time of this, Agnes begins to notice a change come over her husband, a pervading, inscrutable sadness. He is, if anything, more restlessly active than before, spending days and nights in his laboratory, and he is, if possible, even more loving. But in his activity and in his love, there is something frightening. She feels it in the hurry, the effort, the passionate desire to consummate and to clutch of one who knows his days are numbered. But he will make no answer to her inquiries and denies any change in himself. Is he ill? Has he recognized in himself the germ of some fatal disease? That is how we moderns understand the situation. The learned man is able to calculate, perhaps to a month, the moment when his heart will wear out, or his brain give way, or he has spent his life too freely while it belonged only to himself and to science. That is not the medieval notion, the notion of Agnes Alcestis, who, unable to penetrate her husband's secret, seeks, even like the queen of Admetos, for heavenly aid. The ballad tells us that she prays to St. Theodulus, patron of those who suffer from cruel apprehension, and implores him to explain the riddle. In a vision, the riddle is explained. In the days of his loneliness, Dr. Berchthold had promised to give himself over on a fixed date to King Death, in return for the secret of prolonging the life of the plague-stricken. And the date has approached. You remember Admetos in Euripides? Berchthold Weber is more of a king than he. Instead of bemoaning his fate, seeking a victim to replace him, he has kept his counsel and keeps it. Agnes never for a moment dreams of offering to die in his stead. The whole tragedy takes place unspoken. He, knowing his doom, thinks only how to hide the fearful fact to the last, how to make it fall as gently as possible on his wife. She, deciding at once to give her useless woman's life for the life of the man who can comfort and save so many others, lays her plans also in silence. It is the secret agony of these two souls, unable to seek for comfort in one another, which constitutes that unheard-of trial to which the entry in the family Bible is an allusion. And it is these days of unspoken reciprocal farewell which have left their trace, methinks, far more than the hours spent in Death's Valley on Agnes Weberin, making her Agnes Alcestis. It is strange to think, added Dr. Weber musingly, looking up at the steep gable of his ancestral house, at the whitewashed beamed wall festooned with vines, that it all took place here, within these walls, and sometimes I catch myself feeling as if I was seated in the castle of Lear or Elsinore, or in fact the palace of Pherai, where Heracles was a guest, and Apollo. Evening had come on. The upper sky, with swallows crossing and recrossing it, was turning greenish. The slopes and fir woods far off were veiling themselves as in thin crêpe, and the high-pitched roofs, the towers and gable houses of the projecting part of Erlach, were profiled above the ravine like the twilit town in Dürer's print of St. Anthony. 4. Totesdal, the Valley of Death. That also sounds merely an appropriate metaphor, said Dr. Weber, as he took me on a country walk the next morning. Well, it is not. It is a concrete reality. The Valley of Death lies northeast of Erlach, its opening where the brook of death, Todesbach, runs into the Erl, just a mile outside the Bamberg gate. I can show it you all on the ordnance map. And what is more, you are at present standing in the middle of it. He had led me across the high-lying cornfields and the thick fir woods, and then by a scrambling track along the rocks suddenly into a narrow valley. It was a corridor cut as with a knife out of the surrounding tableland, its steep walls of soft yellow stone, fringed at the top with trees and bushes, and barely wider than the shallow stream which stagnated in pools among its stones. In the rest of the world it was a sunny, breezy day, the green crops rustling like watered silk, but here there penetrated neither a ray of sun nor a breath of wind, and the great hemlock stood motionless amongst the oozy green stones of the sluggish, silent stream. After a few yards, the corridor widened into a kind of circular chamber, its floor of thick wet grass, its side more perpendicular still, with hardy little spruce firs and stunted pines striking their wedge-shaped roots into its top, and among them, high up like a hermitage in a Dürer print, was a tiny chapel with wooden extinguisher roof. Dr. Weber sat down on the trunk of the old fir, which must have fallen ages ago, over the wall of the valley. The little chapel, you see, he said, was served until the Reformation by a solitary friar, and to this fact we owe the knowledge that already in the early Middle Ages this valley took its name from death. There seems no reason why. The Bamberg road, indeed, which leads to near its mouth, passes alongside of the Ravenstone, the place of the permanent gallows and the wheel, from which the ghosts of malefactors used to descend, even in my great-grandfather's time, and frighten belated travellers. But that is nearly a mile away, and couldn't account for the name of this valley. Perhaps, indeed, the name is merely a corruption of some word of wholly different meaning, but which changed in this way from a certain appropriate quality. Be this as it may, the Valley of Death, and more particularly this winding of it where we are seated, is the place of the last act of the story of Agnes Alcestis. I told you of the old ballad we used to buy at fairs. Listen to the beginning of it. It happened on a Sunday, in the pleasant month of August, since our Lord Jesus' incarnation for our sins, 1,000 years 544. The good folk of Erlach, with all the town guard with their pikes and crossbows, and all the guilds with banners, many thousand men and women and children, all who could walk or ride or crawl, went forth outside the city walls to look down on the jousting in a certain valley. For you must know that in that place a trusty knight was going to challenge death in person, and force him to restore Frau Agnes, Berchthold Weber's wife, who was willing to die in her husband's stead. And the town crier has summoned the good folk of Erlach from the tower top, and they have gone outside the town, men, women, and children, many thousands, all who could walk or ride or crawl, to look down at the jousting in the Totesdal. That is how the ballad begins, went on Dr. Weber. Then the trusty knight bids the herald blow his trumpet, and 3 times the herald blows, and 3 times calls on death by name. Herr Tod! Herr Tod! Herr Tod! And summons him to give back Frau Agnes or meet the trusty knight in single combat. The 3rd time the herald also throws down the trusty knight's glove. Then Herr Tod appears, riding down the valley on a thin, pale horse. He has on a helmet wreathed with straw, and a gallant black sash embroidered with gold, but with no armour or other garments. For, says the ballad, he had on him no flesh to hurt, and in him had he no blood that could be spilt. The ballad does not mention it, but I imagine my poor ancestress kneeling close by, like the poor princess in the pictures of St. George. They spurred their horses on each other and closed with a hideous shock. The lance of Herr Tod had struck in the pommel of the trusty knight, and very nearly thrown him off his horse. The trusty knight wheeled round his red roan horse and rushed upon his adversary, but alas! His lance merely shivered against the iron ribs of Herr Tod's pale horse, and fell on the knight in splinters. But again the trusty knight wheeled round, letting go the reins on the neck of his red roan, and grasping his great sword with both hands. And as he came up with Herr Tod, who had also drawn, he let the great sword crash down on Herr Tod, and the skeleton, with dreadful screams as of vultures and a rattle of bones such as never was heard, fell backwards to the ground. Then the trusty knight took Frau Agnes behind him on his red roan horse, and carried her back to Erlach, all the inhabitants following, and the bells all ringing greeting to where stood Berchthold Weber, with his 3 young children weeping on their doorstep. That is the end of the ballad, said Dr. Weber, after a pause, rising from the tree trunk and preceding me along the narrow path and across the oozy stream. But there are 2 versions of it which differ in one important particular. The more recent version, written down when Erlach had turned completely Protestant and was smarting from its cruel treatment by Wallenstein, says that the trusty knight was one Dietrich von Krenglingen, whom the father of Agnes had hidden in his house during the persecution of the independent nobles by Kaiser Maximilian. But the earlier version of the ballad, dating from a time when Lutherans and Catholics still lived peaceably together in our town and were not very clearly distinguishable, tells us that the trusty knight was no other than Theodulus, the heavenly patron of the Webers, and who had descended from his fountain to defend them. It seems rather difficult to decide at this distance of time, and I think you may safely choose whichever of the 2 champions you prefer. At a sudden bend, we had come to the mouth of the narrow valley, and in front of us, where its perpendicular sides and fringe of birches and firs ended, there rose, high up against the sunny sky, the distant walls, the towers and high-pitched roofs of Erlach. As regards myself, said Dr. Weber meditatively, as I have learned from comparative mythology that nothing is more usual than to be 2 totally different persons at the same time, I am willing to accept both Dietrich von Krenglingen and Saint Theodulus as the Heracles who released from the bonds of death my ancestress Alcestis. You might be one of those people like me who doesn't like the stories to be interrupted with ads. And this podcast has ads on it. However, there is a solution. If you would like access to the stories without ads and a link to a library of all the stories I've ever done that you can download without ads, you can get that by becoming a patron. So if you join for $5 or the equivalent in your currency a month, you can have all the stories ad-free. So consider becoming a patron. Go to www.patreon.com/Barcud, Barcud. So that was The Lady and Death, not Death and the Lady, by Vernon Lee. Vernon Lee was born in 1856 and died in 1935, just to give you some immediate context. Talking about the Dürer's etching, I've done a story about that. The Dog in Dürer's etching by a Argentinian, I think, Marco De Nevi. If you look him up on my channel, on the Ghost channel, you'll find him. It's a great story. You should listen to that one, I think. Anyway, it's up to you. I'm not telling you what to do what you want. Anyway, so let's say a little bit about Vernon Lee. So, like many of these people, she wasn't really called Vernon Lee. She wasn't even a bloke. She was Violet Paget, born 14th of April 1956 in Boulogne-sur-Mer in France, but her parents were British. So she was raised in a highly intellectual and cosmopolitan environment, and she was fluent in multiple languages and travelled extensively across Europe, particularly in Italy. So I've done a couple of her stories before. I've done Oak of Oakhurst, which is set in Kent, which is a very English ghost story. Then I've done The Wicked Voice, which is set in Venice, which shows, her knowledge of Italy. But, clearly this one's set in German-speaking Switzerland. Interesting stuff, So her upbringing fostered a deep appreciation for history, art, and literature. So she was pretty famous in her time, but mainly for her supernatural stories. But she also wrote a lot of quite modernist literary criticism, travelogues, a lot of meditations about landscape, about classical themes. She was a very erudite woman. She was she dressed as a man, and she was openly lesbian, which was extraordinary in those times. She was a prolific writer, so she did the supernatural fiction, as I was saying, aesthetics, literary criticism, and travel writing. Her first major publications, Studies of the 18th Century in Italy, published in 1880, was a groundbreaking study of Italian Rococo and early Romanticism. She herself was associated with the aesthetic movement. Now, some of you are just chuckling to yourself knowledgeably at this point because you've just accessed your knowledge of the aesthetic movement. Many other people, although they maybe wouldn't admit it, maybe they would. I'd like it if they would. I wasn't totally au fait with the aesthetic movement. You're going like, what's that? What's that? Let me tell you something about the aesthetic movement. So you can't talk about the aesthetic movement without talking about Walter Pater. Good old Walter. And he wrote a book called Studies in the History of the Renaissance, 1873. And the important thing is he encourages people to pursue intense aesthetic experiences. This is the idea that the feeling quality that's obtained from art is the most important thing. So it was a cultural movement, aesthetic movement from the 1860s to the 1890s. Its key phrase is art for art's sake. 10cc added to that, money for God's sake. So you think about somebody like Ruskin. Now, I read Ruskin's biography last year and I quite enjoyed it. So Ruskin, John Ruskin, that is to say, was a great, very important art critic. And he was born 1819, died 1900. He was not part of the aesthetic movement, but his ideas, particularly on Vernon Lee, Ruskin's ideas were really important because I remember she had this Italian focus, and he wrote Stones of Venice as well as many other things. And he was a great European traveller. So he believed, and he wrote things like The Stones of Venice, 1851 to 1853, Modern Painters, which was the work that really brought him to public notice. And his championing of people like Turner in those days. And later the Pre-Raphaelite, he was a big supporter of the Pre-Raphaelites who are associated with the aesthetic movement. But why wasn't Ruskin an aesthete? Well, he was an aesthete, but why wasn't he considered a member of the aesthetic movement? Because Ruskin had a really strong belief that art was had a moral purpose to make society better, to make people better and society better, whereas the aesthetic movement, and later you can see this going into decadence and things like that, it was art for art's sake. It was for the vibe. It wasn't there was no morality to it. Individual members will have had different views on that. So Ruskin promotes the Pre-Raphaelites, and the Pre-Raphaelites can be seen as a bridge to aestheticism, and then aesthetic movement becomes the decadent movement. I saw a fantastic exhibition on decadence in Vienna some years ago now, in the Schönbrunn Palace. It was fantastic, and I'm not a decadent, to be honest. But people like Oscar Wilde and Aubrey Beardsley towards the end of the 19th century, looking at art for art's sake, but embracing sensuality. Absolutely, that's part of it. But also kind of beauty for its own sake, and an element of potentially of debauchery. Certainly, they were seen that way, and maybe they were that way. I mean, I think if you read Dorian Gray, which I've done a version of on the channel, you see that it is a moral tale really as well. So I don't think it's fair to say that Oscar Wilde was amoral, although he was certainly viewed that way, of course, wasn't he? So we've moved a little bit from Vernon Lee, but it's just to say about she had a key part of the aesthetic movement, because remember, it's all about sensual vibes, but she was an intellectual, so she brings a more intellectual and psychological depth to its ideas, and she engages with music, psychological aesthetics, historicism, and what they say is Vernon Lee is important. I said she wasn't just a ghost story writer, because she provides this bridge between 19th century aesthetic philosophy, which we just talked about very briefly, and the kind of 20th century psychological approaches to art. So she's living at the same time, sort of as Sigmund Freud. She's around the same age as him as well, off the top of my head. Yeah, I think she is. She about is. And later on, the early 20th century becomes obsessed with a psychoanalytical understandings of art. And, hang on, the dog's food's ready. It's weird, we buy them raw food, raw feeding, but then we cook it, because they wouldn't eat it at all when it was raw, so we're trying to get them to have it rare. So anyway, that's by the by, it's got nothing to do with Vernon Lee. So Vernon Lee was a brainy, wasn't she? She was a brainy. Now, we talked about how she's part of this aesthetic movement which verges towards the decadence, and it's all about these strong emotional charges. And her ghost stories often explore themes of decadence, obsession, and the uncanny. So certainly The Wicked Voice and Oak of Oakhurst are obsessional stories, I think. This one isn't. This one's a neat little story. We'll talk more about the story in a minute. So she, as I said, she published studies of the 18th century in Italy, 1880, which was a look at Italian art. And then she becomes associated with the aesthetic movement, developing a keen interest in how art and beauty affect human emotions. But of course, get back to Edmund Burke, going back to the a century before, and he writes this essay on the sublime, and the Gothic novelists jump on it because and they say, people said their stories were trash, and they said no, we're evoking the sublime. But if you like, and one way of looking at romanticism, which later sort of is related to aestheticism, I'm not an art historian, I'm not in anything really, but I forgot what I was going to say. Just talk amongst yourselves for a bit. It'll come back to me. So, what was I saying? Oh yeah, so the Gothic is the kind of the sublime through the dark way, the left-hand path to darkness, whereas Romanticism is all about, daffodils. I'm perhaps being a bit flippant there. I like a bit of Romanticism, but it's to do with the light and the sublime and the beautiful and the wonderful, whereas the Gothic goes through darkness. And I think Vernon Lee approaches the sublime through the dark in many ways, through these ideas of the uncanny, of obsession, of decadence. Now, I think it's really interesting to compare her, and I may compare her a bit more with somebody like M.R. James, who was, I think, 8 years younger than her. They died within a year of each other, though. The other things to say about her, you may be getting a picture of the woman, that she was a radical thinker and an early feminist. challenging the gender norms of her time, both in her writing and personal life. She never married and had close emotional relationships with several women, including the artist Clementina Anstruther Thompson, with whom she collaborated on aesthetic studies. Throughout her life, she advocated for women's rights, education, and intellectual independence. And she's kind of a Vernon Lee. If you look on the internet now, you'll see there's a lot of people doing the PhDs on the queerness of her work. So she's kind of caught the tide again after death. She didn't plan to do it. She was an outspoken pacifist, particularly during World War I, which made her unpopular in certain literary and social circles. She published Satan the Waster in 1920, a vehement critique of war, in which she condemned militarism and nationalism as destructive forces. I'd avoid politics, but it's interesting how she's coming from a very very liberal position, and certainly even up to the 1970s and 80s, the liberal position was no war, anti-war, and that seems to have flipped a little bit now. But anyway, boom, boom, not even just spluttering in your coffee, throwing your coffee cups, but never mind. So I don't want to talk too much about that. Later life and legacy, she continued to write on aesthetics and philosophy, but gradually faded from literary prominence. She spent most of her life in Florence, and there's a big collection of her works in Florence. She died on the 13th of February 1935. And as I said, not just feminist literature as well, queer studies and supernatural fiction, and that nexus where they all and they do tend to be studied together. The Gothic was always transgressive, so if you look at Gothic studies, they tend to be very interested in these areas and this crossover. Let us talk a bit about this story. You know the story. It is it's quite a simple story, isn't it? It's mythic, and remember, if you look at her other work, she was very interested in classical myths. I remember reading a piece of hers before I knew who she was, and she does this description, I can't remember which it's in now, of this as if we're in like the 1st century AD and we're visiting a shrine to, I want to say, Bacchus or Pan in the wild woods or in Italy, and just the feeling of the haunting of the place and the spirit of the place, and the numinosity of this shrine, which I think we overlook. I think I got an idea of that when I visited India and went, well, that sounds so stereotypical hippie, doesn't it? And yeah, man. And we went to these temples that were like really alive, and I thought this is what pre-Christian Europe would have been like, the polytheistic place where there was different saints. Well, the saints later take on the role of the local gods in medieval Europe anyway, but and that's interesting for Theodulus. Not Theodolite, he's a Theodulus, Saint Theodulus. So this feeling of numinosity of places and sacred sites and shrines and things like that, which we've lost a lot of now. It's interesting, this play between Protestantism and Catholicism, whereby we see, probably to its chagrin, we see Catholicism as being more of a preserver of this idea of veneration of saints and the sacred nature of certain places, shrines, that you would go to them and you would feel, and you would have miracles happen in the place where the saint has appeared. You can see the direct line right through history, whereas Protestants tend to be associated with rationalism, and it's a gross simplification, but there we are. But I thought it was interesting she brought that split, that dichotomy up in the story. So Saint Theodulus is a real saint who is credited with, Greek name though, is credited with the Christianization of some of the cantons of Switzerland. So he's a local Swiss and South German saint, I believe. Not much is known. I didn't find anything to suggest that Saint Theodulus was a knight, but of course the other thing that she's doing here, and she's a million times cleverer than me, so she knows Dura really well, and so she's playing with this the famous etching of Death and the Maiden. So there's this the devil, and there's a knight in this Dura's etching. Go and look for it. It's a woodcut, I think, and Please don't correct me if I'm wrong. I might be wrong. There's a dog in it. There's the devil in it. There's a knight on his horse. And so, Vernon Lee knows this backwards, forwards, sideways. She's utterly steeped in her art history, And I think this is how come Theodulus is portrayed as this Gothic German knight. The rest of it's a fantastically interesting story, even though it's a myth. So when you start getting into myths, you can dig and dig and dig and never get to the bottom, really. So the knight fights the devil and wins. Whoa, that's extraordinary, isn't it? What does that mean? So remember, this is a woman who's very interested in the psychological aspect of ghost stories as well. So I think this is meant, many times I think writers, things emerge in a writer's work that he or she hasn't intended, but I think she is too smart. I think she is too erudite, and she knows what she's saying. So this night is not a mistake, and it rings, resonates with Dürer's work. But this idea that human, so it's not the devil, it's death, which is this force. If you ever want to read a book, you want to read Carl Jung's, also Swiss, Carl Jung's book, Answer to Job. In a nutshell, you may disagree with this, but Jung's idea was that the God image in Judeo-Christianity has evolved, and so we have the quite tantrum-prone God of the Old Testament who'll turn you to a pinch of salt, and you basically better do what he says, and if you don't please him, he's going to slam you down, and you've got to keep to his rules or else. And this is seen, many Christians have been troubled by this, because in the New Testament we have the Prince of Peace, don't we? The personal relationship with the loving God. So how does that square with this tyrant, basically? And I'm looking at a copy of Milton's Paradise Lost here, where Satan actually comes out as a bit of a hero. And so, going back to Carl Jung in his book An Answer to Job says, Job, if you know the story, Job is a God-fearing, decent man. He does everything. He keeps by the rules, and the devil comes along. The devil works for God at this point. So there's not this manichaeistic black and white, goodies and baddies. The devil he tests people for God. That's his job. Which is submerged in modern Christianity, I think. I think popular Christianity, I'm not a theologian either, but it seems to me that popular Christianity has, by and large, folk Christianity is manichaeistic. That is, it sees the world black and white, a battle between good and evil. Whereas, of course, Orthodox Christianity, not with a big O, although with a big O as well, they would say that the devil is not equal to God in no sense. The devil is a creation within God's universe. He is utterly subservient to God. There can be no question of equivalence, But I think folk Christianity sees that. Anyway, getting back to death, and getting back to Jung. So, in The Answer to Job, basically the devil tries Job to see whether his faith in God or his devotion to God will break, and it doesn't, no matter what horrible things are done to Job. And Jung's argument is that this represents the God before that is not moral, and he's amoral, and he becomes moral until we get the New Testament God who suffers with us. We are creations and we suffer, and Jesus Christ suffers as much as we do, if not more, and that is the kind of a redemption, isn't it? Yeah, there's a lot more to it than that. People have been talking about this for 2,000 years. So in this case, with that in mind, this knight, who is a human, defeats death, which is a massive victory. No humans really defeat death. And then we look at the symbolism of the wife. So there's this question about her being, she just marries this old bloke to spite her dad. That's the first thing that was thrown at us. Then a bit later on, there's it's surfaced, isn't it, that it may be that she kind of out of devotion for this very learned, very kind man, because this man, although he's shunned by, she maybe felt a bit like this as well, that she was trying her best to do the right thing in the world, and other people who were a bit more narrow-minded would just be, not approving of her. I don't know if that's true, but it strikes me it possibly is true. And then, they don't like him because he's a bit weird, because he's a man who he doesn't do what society says he should do. He does what his heart tells him is the right thing, to the extent that he has made a deal with death, that if death allows him to save all these innocent people, he's massively moral, isn't he? He's far more moral than death. Death is just doing a transaction, then he can take him early, and then so he's a sainted man, really, in many ways, and then his wife also becomes saintly. She is prepared to lay down her life in the stead of her husband's, because she talks about, and take this as tongue in cheek. This is a feminist writer. And she says her useless woman's life, it's not equivalent to this learned man's life. So it's actually it's better to spend her life as a sacrifice. But that is also massively moral as well, that this wife is prepared to do that. And in Extremis, they ask for an intercession, and St. Theodulus comes and intercedes, and things are pretty cool. Now, the final thing I wanted to say about that story was the fact that Conrad, the descendant of Agnes and Mr. Weber, the original doctor, he says, there are two versions, a Protestant and a Catholic version. So one is the rationalist version, which is the Protestant version, which says, oh no, it was this German knight. It's not very rationalist to say fought death, but it's better than the alternative. And the other, the older, as he said, the older Catholic version is, I can't remember what it was, but the point being, that what is that about? And it makes me think of Ian McGilchrist then, and his right brain and left brain, and he talks about how the right brain is happy to live with paradox and contradiction, and have the opposites completely living, not in opposition. Another Jungian idea, but the rationalist brain, the left brain, needs to have everything cut and dried. And I wonder if it's not an allusion to the fact that we try to impose this rationalist view on the world, which isn't rationalist. We try to make the world conform to the way we think it ought to behave. It ought to be like this. And in a sense, that's like trying to do deals with God, isn't it? God is not to be dealt with, But anyway, so look how much you can get out of a very simple seeming story. I think this story actually would repay your PhD if you want to go and do it. So the final thing I wanted to say, which came up in this, and I'm realising I'm running on, is to compare Vernon Lee with her contemporary M.R. James. So she comes out a decade before, really, and we talked about her influences, decadence, aesthetics, symbolism, also influenced by Henry James, as we say many times, William James's brother. So Henry James being, we've done Henry James, so we need to go into that. So he wrote Psychological Ghost Stories, Turn of the Screw, etc. M.R. James, Montague Rhodes, was a much more conservative, in all senses, politically, culturally figure, and he's talking about 19th century English folklore, very interested in the medieval world, not the classical world that Vernon Lee was interested in, although she's interested in the medieval world as well, and ecclesiastical history. So he's not massively interested in theology or philosophy. I mean, shoot me down, but it isn't prevalent. It doesn't jump out of his work. So but he's got a product which is more digestible. We still have BBC making adaptations of M.R. James's stories, not Vernon Lee's. So it says, and her prose was more complex, literary and aesthetic, and appeals more to the Henry James rather than those wanting the quick, ghostly thrill of M.R. James. Now, gender bias, this, you work with your notes. Male story writers like M.R. James, Algernon Blackwood, Arthur Machen were more widely recognised, while Lee's work dealing with art, femininity and ambiguous hauntings was not as well marketed. I think ambiguity in ghost stories became more important in the 20th century. People like, I'm thinking of Robert Aikman and people like that. And I've talked before about how the horror in M.R. James's work, it's not a cheap ghostly thrill. There's something deeply weird about his most horrifying stories. So what we would say, if we were to sum it up, we'd say Vernon Lee's ghost stories are intimate, aesthetic and psychological, rooted in the decadence and obsession of her characters, whereas M.R. James's ghost stories are external, cautionary and folk-like tale, warning against meddling with things best left undisturbed. This is a really interesting point, because here we are meddling with death in this story, whereas M.R. James is like, don't dig up that whistle, don't dig up that hill, leave it all alone. Whereas she's saying, no, take on these chthonic, I'm throwing them all in today, numinous, chthonic, I'm throwing them all in today. I'll be saying squamous next. So there you go. So if we look at their backgrounds as well, so in terms of class, now you may be aware, if you're not British, particularly English, that the English are obsessed with social class. And there are lots of markers of class, but these two came from a similar social class. The difference is, so Vernon Lee is upper middle class, but raised in a cosmopolitan, bohemian, intellectual environment. She is your classic liberal, if you like. M.R. James is upper middle to upper class, deeply embedded in British academic and clerical traditions. Your typical conservative in many ways. She was largely self-educated, raised by intellectual expatriate patients, informal classic and artistic education in Europe, and he was properly, formally educated. If I say properly, I don't mean anything by that, other than it was done by the rules. So he went to Eton, King's College, Cambridge, steeped in formal classical, biblical and medieval scholarship. Her cultural influences are aestheticism, decadence, symbolism, European philosophy as opposed to Anglo-Saxon philosophy, informal classical and art, I've done that, romanticism, Walter Pater, Henry James, him, English antiquarian, medievalism, biblical studies, folklore, ghost story traditions from Dickens and Lefano. Also, he's pretty interested in demonology, I think. She lives this cosmopolitan life on the continent of Europe, mixing with artists, who would call themselves artists or artists, where he lives his life pretty much in Cambridge or in Windsor for Eton. He did travel beyond Britain, but he was happy with his lot, Now, also personal life. She is openly lesbian. By all accounts, the best belief is he was closetedly, if that's the word, gay, so interesting. Her this is the difference. But I think, again, your other PhD is a comparison of the stories of these two contemporaries, Vernon Lee and M.R. James, looking at their supernatural fiction and comparing and contrasting, particularly because their social class, with the provisos and caveats, blah, 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 already mentioned, is very similar. They're not coming from a mill working background in Scunthorpe. I don't know if there were any mills in Scunthorpe. Steel makers in Scunthorpe. They're in Scunny. They're coming from a pretty well-heeled position, both of them. They would probably sound very similar. That great marker of English speech is accent. They probably sound very similar. I don't know if we have any recordings of them. I need to... Simon Roper's your man for that. And they're both gay. But although, that's like saying two men are similar because they both have brown hair. But, when you're struggling for points, you just make any points. But there we are. So fascinating stuff. I really liked it. I need to get back to some pulp for the lovers of pulp. I need to throw some... weird tales at you. But there we are. Okay, I should say, so if you notice something about the final thing I'm going to say is the sound quality in this is I used to use Adobe Audition, and the thing about Adobe was it was about £23 a month to subscribe. It's the pattern, isn't it? I hate it, like, but and the trick they had was you paid for a year. You paid every month, but you signed up to a year's contract. Okay, so and they auto renew. So you might say with most people you can switch off the auto renew, so it just comes in. No, you can't with Adobe. You cannot switch it off. The only way to switch off the auto renew is to cancel your subscription. So I contacted them. I said, look, I don't really like the auto renew. I may well continue, but I don't like auto renew because it just hits you, you know. And there you are, and you're tied in for another year, and I don't like that. And they said, oh no, you have to cancel. I said, well, okay, cancel. You can hear me having a strop. And they said, okay, that'll be a cancellation fee of several £100. You what? You joking me? And they said, no, we're not joking you. So you couldn't cancel. You couldn't switch off auto renew without cancelling. If you cancelled, so my terror was, and it was a terror, was I would forget it, and then boom, there's my auto renew, and I go, no, I'm going to cancel, and I've got to pay the full year, you know. So I didn't want to do it, which is a pity because it's a bit like cutting off my nose to spite my face, because it actually was pretty good. It met all my needs. So then I thought, well, what am I going to use? Well, I got Reaper, which I quite like, but I thought, I'll tell you what I'll try is GarageBand, which is, I've got it on my Mac anyway, so why not? So I thought, but of course I now have to learn how to use it, and I haven't quite yet, so you may notice that the quality isn't as good. Also, the other thing was I decided to leave tiny mistakes in, because this kind of to differentiate myself from AI, which I've talked about elsewhere, and I'm not going to go in again. So I think that's it. Thank you.
Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back, don't they? Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked room today, didn't you?
How do the dead come back, Mother? What's the secret of the dead come back? Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back, don't they? Isn't that so? Isn't that so? Isn't that so? Isn't that so?